Welcome, welcome, everybody, to this week's Sunday show for patrons. We really appreciate all of y'all's support. I'm really excited to share this conversation with y'all that we're about to be having with our friend and comrade and teacher, Milton Allimadi. Milton does so much stuff, but I really wanted to shout out a few things for y'all to be checking out. Definitely check out his Patreon project, African History Club. It's an incredible resource. You can listen to him weekly on WBAI 99.5 every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And we'll also be putting all of his social handles in the text of this because he's a great follow as well. Thanks so much, Milton, for joining us today to talk about Walter Rodney,
right?
Who is an incredible figure. And we'll get to that in just a second. I just wanted to take just 2 minutes off the top because obviously it's a very fluid situation. Right. But in Chad right now, there have been mass protests, including deaths now, as people are demanding a return to civilian rule after the military has taken control after the death last week of the president of Chad, Idriss Déby. Could you just give us a sort of rundown as to what's happening there and what the outlook is looking like?
Right. Okay. Well, I think this is just one example to me of the youth in Africa really saying enough is enough. And they're not going to take it anymore. A lot of people may not know that Africa is one of the youngest continents. I think 60% of the population under the age of 25. Just imagine. And they're just tired where you have a situation where somebody is calling himself president for decades. You know, this guy had been there for 31 years, Idriss Déby. And I could sense that something was going on when I read the account of his death, April 19, on the BBC, that he supposedly had gone to the front lines to fight against insurgents. And that in that major battle, 300 enemy fighters were killed and 5 government soldiers died. And one of the persons that happened to die was the president himself. And I tweeted, I said, come on, can't you come up with a better story? This didn't make sense at all. So I didn't buy that. And I've been speaking with comrades from Chad, and they say there was actually an ongoing internal power struggle. What happened is a relative of his, a cousin, I believe, also ran against him. They just had elections. And the day he died was when the results, quote unquote results, predetermined results were announced, that he won like with 80 something percent. But when that cousin challenged him, he supposedly was very aggravated and angry and got the cousin's mother killed. And this was retaliation. And that there is some division in the armed forces, including the high command in the military. And that's been clear now because when his son, Mohammed Déby, was announced as his successor, one of the generals, who's not a former general, who's actually a general on the armed forces right now, said, you know, this isn't right. We have to follow the procedures. And we have a constitution that says if the president should die, the speaker of the National Assembly would become president until new elections are held. I think that period is 3 months. So the military steps in with the backing of France, of course. And France is now, according to my comrades from Chad, fighting alongside the Chadian military against the insurgents who are trying to topple this government. And I'm speaking to civilians, but they're saying there are many civilians that are part of this insurgency. Because they saw this as the only way of getting rid of this guy who had been there for 31 years with French support. Chad has a lot of oil, so that's why Chad is of great interest to the West. And Chad also basically rents its military to France to fight alongside the quote unquote jihadist in the Sahara and the Sahel, including in Mali. So France obviously wants that commitment to continue and wants to continue its dominating influence over Chad and many other West African countries. And President Macron was there for the funeral of Debbie, and basically for the coronation of the son, Muhammad, as the successor. But it looks like the Chadians are not having that. They've been protesting even here in the US in front of the French embassy in Washington, DC. It's a protest that they have on a weekly basis now. And in Paris and other European cities, and obviously in Chad itself, you can see it escalating now. That's where things stand. I think the youth are really determined to end this neocolonialism, where you have a so-called president who serves the interest of the former empire. So it's not only in Chad. We're seeing uprisings in Uganda as well, in Cameroon, and all these countries that are still under the strong influence of the former empire.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot that we need to be covering more on the show Love Reckoning. But it is interesting, and to sort of pivot into the focus of today's conversation, Walter Rodney. It is interesting to see in the past few months and a couple of years in particular how overt French neocolonialism has been. They're very much front and center versus sort of pulling strings from the background. And understanding that analysis and why that matters is something I think Walter's work can really help us, to uncover. So to sort of introduce Walter Rodney to folks who might not be familiar with him and his work, I just wanted to start off by asking, how you first came across his work and how you would say it might have influenced your political perspective, historical perspective as well.
Right. Okay. So he, I lived in Tanzania also. I'm born in Uganda. I lived in Tanzania and went to actually secondary school in Tanzania too in the 1970s. But obviously I was too young. I didn't know of Rodney's work. I'd heard of him, but it wasn't until much, much later, while I'm already here in the United States in college, that I really started reading his work for the first time. Starting with the major one, of course, how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Rodney, really, I would compare the way he broke things down in the simplest elements to Malcolm X. Malcolm was very good in breaking down these complex concepts to ordinary folks. And that was a gift. And Rodney had that same gift too. Speaking to the masses, always connecting to the grassroots. And that separates him from a lot of the scholar intellectual activists, in that he not only wrote, but he actually rolled up his sleeves, so to speak, to, as he said in one of his books that I also like, grounding with my brothers. And that's what he really did. He did that when he was in Tanzania. He was Guyanese born in 1942. He went to the University of West Indies, the Jamaica, the prestigious campus on Mona. And then from there, he went to the School of Oriental and African Studies, SORS, where he did his PhD in history, focusing, of course, African history. And while he was there, he was, one of his mentors was CLR James. And then from London, he went to teach in Tanzania. The president of Tanzania was Julius Nyerere, who was advocating Ujamaa, which was his brand of African socialism. Rodney taught there for a few years, and then he went back to Jamaica, his alma mater, to teach at the university there. He continued something that he had started in Tanzania, which was to go, in Tanzania, he would go to what they call the Ujamaa villages, which were these collectivized agricultural communities that Tanzania was trying to build up. And he was interact with the people and become involved, so that he was not only studying Ujamaa from an academic perspective, he actually went and he lived and he worked with them. So he continued this approach in Jamaica, teaching at the university, but also going and communing with people, particularly the so-called people that are looked down upon, the Rastafari. They had this stereotypical representation of them as outcasts, people that are not part of quote unquote mainstream communities. And he said, this is nonsense. So he connected with them. He took the academy to the masses, and he brought the masses onto campus and started raising their consciousness and explaining the role that their own post-colonial governments have in perpetuating the conditions under which they still live, the dominated position, not only in the Caribbean, but in Africa as well. And this is a message that is very threatening to these neocolonial, I call them caretakers, right? So when he went to attend a conference in Montreal, the Montreal International Conference of Black Writers in 1969, 68, 69, he was not allowed to come back. He was declared as a persona non grata by the Jamaican government of Prime Minister Shearer at the time. So he was basically not allowed to come back, and his family, his wife, Patricia, and young kids, kicked out of the country. So he had nowhere to go. So he went back, and by the way, uprising erupted in Kingston with multi-million dollars worth of destruction of property. The youth who connected to Rodney and understand what he was really trying to do just came up and started tearing down parts of the city. That's how enraged they were. And they're called the so-called Walter Rodney riots,
And those were,
there,
from my understanding, like they were pretty targeted too. Like government buildings, bus stations and stuff, which just shows how great his political education was.
There you go. Thank you for mentioning that. It shows you that they were really understanding it the right way. So from there, he went back to Tanzania. He taught for a few more years from 1969 to 1974. And then from there, he was lecturing around the world, including here in the US. He taught at SUNY Binghamton, and he lectured on a number of other colleges, and would also give a lot of guest lectures, including to Columbia University. And then ultimately, he was appointed. He was offered a professorship in the University of Guyana. But before he could go to take up his appointment, it was withdrawn by the government at that time under Forbes. But he decided to go back to Guyana anyway, because that's ultimately home. He considered Jamaica home, he considered Tanzania home, but Guyana was where he was born. And Guyana was where he really had a big mission to accomplish. Because as you know, the historical legacy of Guyana has been this manufactured ethnic conflict and rivalry between Indian Guyanese and African Guyanese, which is a legacy of the British colonial rule. The owners of capital, the planters, the plantation owners, encouraged that conflict in order to weaken their potentially common agenda, to increase their bargaining power by keeping them fighting between themselves. And that legacy, even after Britain had left, unfortunately, continued with the new elite, the Indian elite as well as the African elite, so that the political parties, were really ethnic based. One party supported almost exclusively by African Guyanese and the other by Indian Guyanese. And Walter Rodney did not like this, of course. And when he went back, he and his colleagues founded the Working People's Alliance. That was the name of the party. And the party really started growing tremendously. And they found that there was a sizable part of the society that did not approve of this ethnic race-based politics. And they really gravitated to the party that Walter Rodney and his colleagues, African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese, were trying to create. And this presented a tremendous challenge to the establishment. And ultimately, he paid with his life when he was assassinated in 1980. So that is the summation of Walter Rodney, a Marxist political economist, a public intellectual, very well connected to the masses. That's how I would summarize.
Yeah, and that's like one aspect of, because there's so many different Walters in a way, right? You can read him very academically, and like his histories are phenomenal.
Yes.
Both his work on underdevelopment in Africa, but also what which just came out sort of recently was the Russian Revolution, A View from the
Absolutely, which I just ordered recently. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, but like he's able to deal with all of these different things. So like as somebody to just read and learn from, he's great. But also the way that he was a teacher. In quite a radical way too, with what you're talking about with grounding and the fact that he was giving lectures to the masses essentially. Right. I don't know. It's like that kind of dual role that is really critical, and in particular, the role of political education.
Yes.
In building mass movements. And I want to hear a little bit more about what you're thinking about his teaching style, but just to give folks a flavor of this, Matt, if you have it sort of ready, this first clip on Amin.
So you move from one Caribbean state to another. You find these aberrations that sometimes when you think of certain films or certain novels, certain pieces of fiction which have been denounced as fiction, as having no bearing on reality, you wonder whether in fact you are dealing with fiction or with reality. Prime ministers who shuffle around, who resign and threaten to resign more often than any others in the world. Prime ministers who dress themselves up in different costumes. One day a general, the next day chief of police. Prime ministers in Africa who go to the prisons and haul out prisoners and beat them themselves. A prime minister who makes his wife the chief of the opposition. Those are not things taken from novels. Those are descriptions of what actually transpires in African and Caribbean states. And really what one has to ask is, why is that possible? If we were to take a well-known and classic example to which attention has been focused for a number of years, why isn't Amin possible? Not who he is and what he does, but how was it possible in a place like Uganda? And it seems to me that the possibility of a buffoon and a murderer becoming a head of state is very much connected with the location of Africa in the international capitalist system, its marginalization, particularly in cases such as Uganda, where the primary crop was no longer as important, and the fact that the distortions produced as a particular cumulative class led at the time by Obote tried to absorb as much as it could, tried to squeeze as much as it could out of the Ugandan people. It created this distortion, and out of this the monster Amin arose. But he's not just an individual phenomenon, he can be explained in those historical terms. And because Uganda is not central to the production of surplus in the world system, then imperialism sits back and laughs. They don't have to enter and intervene in that situation. They simply have to hold him up as an example of what an African ruler is like. Another large black man ruling this society and being a buffoon, you see. So they gain both ways. They are responsible for the fundamental distortions, but then they sit back and gain some propaganda value from the fact that Africans behave in that way when they are located in a specific historical and class conjuncture. And this can be illustrated in other ways. Not only the areas that are marginal, but the areas that have been reintegrated into capitalism are also made to carry out the same absurd political functions. The old Congo, now Zaire, has never really been relinquished by imperialism because of its importance as a zone of mining production and as an area for the concentration of monopoly capital. second to no other part of the world with the exception of South Africa. And in that area, it is imperialism that has consistently maintained the most reactionary and authoritarian and in a certain sense almost comic regime in Africa, that of Mobutu of Zaire, a man who descends from heaven every day on the television. That is his role in Zaire. But on every occasion, as you know, that the Zairean people have made serious efforts to deal with this, imperialism has been quick to intervene. This is not a Uganda growing coffee. We're talking now about uranium and copper and gold and diamonds and bauxite, so that we don't play around there and describe Mobutu as a buffoon. You move in and you help him to liquidate large numbers of other Africans who are trying to create a rational society.
Yeah. Yeah, it captured it perfectly, man. And you can hear how at ease the audience is, right? But following him very intently, but at the same time in a very relaxed manner. And I think that's often the best way really to get people to deal with these issues in a less restrictive or even oppressive way, you know? They can become overwhelming if you only approach it from a very serious perspective. You know, so he throws in the comical aspect while at the same time being able to convey the serious message behind it. And that, I think, was a great gift that Rodney had, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say he's very funny. There's, you know, there's another line in there that it doesn't even matter what he was talking about, but like he says, like, you know, chew on that for a while. And then he pauses and he says, it's going to take a lot of chewing.
You know, referring to Sadat, when Sadat was trying to sign this oil deal to take nuclear waste from Europe and to have it buried in Egypt. And he had said that, you know, African leaders don't surprise him anymore. They've exhausted his capacity to be surprised. But when he heard about Sadat, the leader of a major African country with a sophisticated, educated population, trying to do something like that, then, you know, once again, he was indeed surprised.
It reminded me of a conversation I remember having with Michael about comedy and how it can, like, sometimes people are just laughing at a shortcut to truth almost. Like that's it's basically just kind of consolidating what we kind of know in a very understandable way for everybody. And yeah, the way he went from being funny to immediately back into the serious issues that people need to be thinking about, masterful.
Yes, and you keep the audience engaged, and that's really a great gift. You make them wanting to hear more and wanting to come back again next time. You know, that was really great. And of course, you know, Amin was installed by the British and by the Israel, because Israel actually used to train Uganda's Air Force, and they had a good relationship with Amin as well. At that time, Obote was becoming closer to President of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, who was, of course, a committed socialist. And he had just put out a document called the Common Man's Charter, which was his version of steering Uganda towards socialism. And he had also, together with Nyerere, they were preparing to break diplomatic relations with Britain because the British would continue to sell weapons to what was then Rhodesia and to South Africa. So when they had the Commonwealth meeting in Singapore in 1971, the Prime Minister of Britain, I think it was Edward Heath, said something like, you know, it would be pretty nice, sometimes paraphrasing, if some of the people attending this conference were never to go back home as president. And it seemed clear that he knew that Obote was not going to be going back to Uganda as president. And Amin was installed, and he was there for almost 10 years. And as Rodney said, because Mobutu was equally horrific for the Congo, the country he changed the name to Zaire. But as Rodney pointed out, Congo was not growing coffee like Uganda. No, Congo had cobalt, uranium, copper, diamond, gold, you name it. So Congo was not going to be, even though Mobutu was equally outrageous, he was not going to be demonized the way Amin was. They could afford to do that to Amin. And whenever there was an uprising in the Congo, the US would intervene. Primarily, they would send Moroccan troops using American planes to support Mobutu's military and crush any rebellion in the Congo.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point that Rodney makes, and I think, you know, especially to our audience, is a great example of how to use that like Marxist analysis versus like a liberal analysis, right? Because you look at two, you know, people like Mobutu and Amin, and you say, okay, well, there's very comical aspects of this regime, but why is it qualitatively different? Why does it have a different relationship with the United States and Europe? And it's like, okay, well, because there are very important, you know, resources there for global capital, which is, you know, it's critical in any region or any part of the world, but in Africa in particular, has been such a hallmark of, you know, the post-colonial or neo-colonial stages.
Which is a tragedy, because at the same time, you know, it prevents the continent from realizing its full potential, right? It allows the narrative to always be superficial, and it makes it difficult for even people who are want to have a positive attitude toward Africa and to contribute toward the changes that young people want in Africa, the progressive changes, because they fail to connect when they see characters like Idi Amin, like Mobutu. Now you had Idris Deby, who just died. You have in Cameroon, Paul Biya, who lives more than half of the year in a hotel in Switzerland, right? That's where he lives. And he comes to visit his country occasionally,
Jesus
you know,
Christ. Yeah.
even as the Civil War is tearing the country up, in a multi-$1,000 hotel suite in Switzerland. There was a one-person protest that went viral. It went so viral that even the Wall Street Journal wrote about it and ended up writing about why the person was protesting in front of that hotel. So it could no longer avoid bringing out the story of Paul Biya, this corrupt dictator of 40 years, and how he comes there with millions of dollars in cash on a regular basis while this country's essentially descending in chaos. And you have in Uganda, you have Yoweri Museveni, who is in the process of stealing election from a candidate who represents the youth, really, Bobby Wine, a 38-year-old candidate who essentially won the elections. But Americans or outsiders who want to be much more conscious and interested in Africa would not understand that there's serious struggle going on if the focus is on characters like Idi Amin, Mobutu, and their idiosyncrasies, you know? But when you listen to Rodney explain the reason why there's a Idi Amin, there's a Mobutu, then you really can develop a serious appreciation for the struggle ongoing in Africa. And that's why he was very gifted at that. He did not dismiss the fact that, yes, there is an Idi Amin. But rather than get defensive about it and say, oh, you know, we are ashamed that this is one of us, he said, no, you know, Amin is no accident. Amin is installed by the same system that we actually engaged against, fighting against. You know, so while they may portray him as, oh, this is them, you know, this is, as he puts it, another African leader, another typical African leader, when in fact it is not. And that's why it's important to have a lecture like the one that you just played excerpts from.
Yeah. And his points too about the way, that colonialism shifts from, being the flag of France or the flag of England to aid and dependency on that is also really important for understanding modern Africa.
Yeah, it was interesting to watch those lectures, and now we're at a more, I guess, mature stage of that contradiction, basically, or shift. Yeah, and I like the way you just placed it, the replacement of the flags, with sometimes I refer to them as African governors on behalf of empire. You see, because now it was very easy to condemn colonialism when you had European governors. You see, at some point that just didn't fly anymore. To have European governors ruling in Africa in the 20th century, going to the 21st century. But now you have something which is even much better. You have an African serving the interest of the former empire. Mm-hmm. But how can you claim that colonialism still exists when you have African presidents? Every African country has an African president. So colonialism is over. Mm-hmm. If you have any beef, take it up with the Africans, you see? So it's terrible for the working class, for the farmers, because now collectively, as African countries, they are exploited by the industrialized countries in terms of not controlling the price of their commodities, whether it's agricultural produce or whether it's from the minerals in the mines, right? They have no control. They have to take the price that the industrialized countries are willing to pay for it. That's one side. Then on the other side, they have no control over the price of the manufactured items that they import. No, just because we use your resources, it doesn't mean we're going to sell the products to you at a reasonable price. No, we sell it at the price that the automobile companies want for it, the people that manufacture the electronic equipment want for it, the people that manufacture the pharmaceuticals want for it. So look at that buying. So that's the international context. And then domestically, you have the Amins, the Mobutus, the Musevenis, extorting their people the same way that the outside world is extorting these countries. They're sucking surplus from the rural farmers, from the mine workers. They get their cut. The elite get their cut, whether it's the leadership and the family and the military that sustains them in power and the police force. The vast majority of the Africans are suffering in those conditions. And that's what Walter Rodney meant when he said the system has become even regressive, under this, the so-called post-colonial era. He said, yes, defeating and ending former colonialism was important, but that was not the end. That was only a means toward the end.
Yeah, and I think, and we have one more shorter bit that I'm about to play, but it's also interesting too how he locates the struggle in like the global chain of capitalism, but he makes really, especially in the conversation which I'll post for folks, I've already posted on our Patreon, A Crisis in the Periphery, Africa and the Caribbean. He locates this historical struggle in the Congo and in Uganda. But his class analysis is also really strong. We played this last night on the show, so we'll play a different section. But he talks about how, sometimes one of the more in question is not like what the government is doing or what the best policy should be, but who is doing the policies, right? And that's one thing that I think is really interesting. If you read Rodney, or even someone who I'm, very familiar with is like Frantz Fanon, is this question, right? You get the revolution, you get to, you end colonialism, right? End colonialism. And then this national bourgeoisie comes into power.
The new enemy.
And it's a fluid dynamic too. It's not just like one or the other, right? You need to implement, some petty bourgeois and bourgeoisie to fight against colonialism, because that's the shared struggle. but very quickly you see how this becomes
as Cabral put it, he said, how do we get the bourgeoisie to commit suicide? How do we get them to really, swallow their interest at some point for the benefit of the masses? That's how Cabral posed it.
Which I think is on point. And let me put this this clip up here just a minute, because I think it's very solid.
Is what is required at the present time. And it seems to me, as we look at one African country after another, at one Caribbean country after another, what we are in fact facing is a phenomenon in which, whether the governments claim to be progressive or not, whether the countries are large or small, whether they're former French-speaking or former English-speaking territories, there is the same tendency for the fossilization of the state almost. It hardens as an apparatus that is totally isolated from and alienated from the vast majority of the people in the society, who in no way are allowed to practice any democratic choice, which has little to do with just elections. It has to do with whether they make choices, whether they influence choices in their own society. And the answer, when you pose that question, is invariably no. The pattern of development in our society has been consistently to deprive the working people of the capacity to make choices. And sometimes we do this under the—
That is just brilliant. And one thing I think of automatically, always actually, I think about it a lot, is the power to negotiate agreements with the International Monetary Fund or to take loans from the World Bank. You have a handful of people that are unaccountable, people that are not genuinely elected, having that authority. Just think about that. Would the United States accept an illegitimate administration negotiating with a foreign powers to take loans that United States citizens would be responsible for? It's absurd. Obviously, you would have a revolution, rightfully so. And that's what Rodney was pointing at, the superficial election process that we have in many of these African countries, that many of these leaders are happy to conduct since they determine the outcome. And they say, once we do this, this satisfies the demand of the Western countries that you must hold elections, when in fact, the elections themselves have no bearing to whether people are actually influencing anything that determines their lives and their destinies.
Yeah, and it's, one example we've been talking about on the show, it's not Africa, but it's, Argentina. They elected, a progressive government, not a radical socialist government or anything like that. But after years and years and years of like right-wing, free market forces,
right,
they're now in this situation where they're having to negotiate with international bondholders and the IMF to make sure that they can provide people with COVID payments and things like that, right?
Think about that.
Is that democracy in a functional sense?
It's really preposterous. And that's where you see, if you break it down clearly, I think conscious people can see the need for revolutions in many of these countries. It is absolutely 100% justifiable. If you ask people, put yourself in the conditions of the folks in those countries, you're a conscious person. Would you just sit around and let this happen and continue? You're going to be further squeezed of surplus over not something that you had no role in undertaking, no part of that agreement or commitment. And the worst thing is this, that these entities that provide those loans know that as well. So why would the World Bank be giving any loans to, right now, Uganda, for example, is asking for the World Bank to suspend interest payment and to invite additional capital, when in fact, millions of dollars, I think it was about 300 million, was provided last year for so-called COVID benefit relief. And many of us wrote to the World Bank and we said, don't be crazy. The guy is a military dictator and the money is going to go into the military because elections are upcoming in January 2021. Still went ahead and sent the resources. And the IMF provided an additional $491 million. And now last week, the government in Uganda was telling Reuters that they now need suspension of interest payment on all these loans, and they need additional new capital. It is just mind-boggling. We need, we in the outside, as activists that are serious and committed, need to engage these institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, whether it's online demonstrations, whether it's physical demonstrations. Once we have enough people understanding what is going on, and we can build allies that are interested in helping African countries get away from this grip, we need to engage them and denounce them and say, why should people in Uganda or any other African country be put under those oppressive conditions when in fact you knew all along that you were engaging with an unrepresentative so-called leader in any one of these countries.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to have that knowledge that people like you and Walter Rodney provide us with, so that we can have these deeper critiques. Because one thing that's very frustrating, especially with the IMF and World Bank over the past 5 years, is you're getting all these people within those institutions who will say things like, oh, we know the IMF has a bad history when it comes to developing countries, right? And then they still continue the same kind of activities, right? Which is exhausting, right? It's like, okay, well, great. It's great that you recognize what happened in the 80s was bad, right? But why are you still doing it today?
Right. So that's like a calculated PR, of course, maneuver. Let's see how much mileage we can get out of this propaganda,
It's the new game in play. But there's so much. I hope that, this was just a brief taste into the work of Walter Rodney. I hope people listening to this will, spend some time and engage with his work, because there's a lot that you can gain and learn from it, both through history and also through how to teach and engage with people. And thank you so much, Milton, for joining us
anytime.
again.
I'm always really pleased when I come on your show. So I look forward to hopefully another invitation soon.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Milton.
All right. Stay strong, guys.